You are listening to an American Free Press podcast.
Joining me on the line is Simon Rosh. Simon, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
I saw an interview that you had done recently. I know that you are here in the United States, and I believe it's for 6 months. You can tell listeners all that, and that this is going to be one of your last interviews before you head back to your country of South Africa. I want to get into exactly what it is you were doing here and the purpose of it, but before we do, for the benefit of the listeners, can you give them a little bit of background about who you are?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Dave. I am a 46-year-old male from South Africa, and I'm the head of the headquarters of an organization called Uitlanders, which is the world's largest non-state civil defense organization. And we are constituted under international law as a civil defense organization preparing for a civil war in South Africa, which is something that has been promised to the white people by black leaders in South Africa now on many occasions. And our leader, the founder of our organization, had the foresight some years ago to begin to prepare in this manner, in a legal, non-militant, non-militaristic, non-seditionist, non-insurrectionist manner, to protect civilian non-combatants. That is to say, we are not at all militant, and our goal is to provide a civil defense solution to non-combatants in the event of the civil war.
Thank you. Now, I'm looking at your website, and I guess an American might pronounce it Uitlanders, but what is the exact pronunciation of that again?
Uitlanders. Uitlanders. The UI, it's S-U-I-D to make up the word Suid, or the first part of the word Uitlanders, and it's a sound that doesn't occur in English, so it's difficult to mimic it, and it's okay if people don't get it right, but Uitlanders is the precise pronunciation.
Thank you, Simon. Almost like the word sight.
Yes.
Now, you were born and raised in South Africa. Do you have an idea or a sense or maybe direct knowledge of your ancestors when they first arrived there?
Yes, Dave, I come from Irish ancestry, so I'm not a part of that portion of the white people of South Africa who have been there since the 6th of April, 1652, when the first permanent settlement was established in South Africa, the first permanent white settlement. I am fourth generation Irish of Irish stock, and my forebears came to South Africa in the late 1800s.
Are there a lot of Irish or other cultures there, nationalities?
Yes, there are, Dave. The white people in South Africa are more or less broken into two broad groups, and that is 60% the Boers or the Afrikaners. The terms don't mean the same thing, but for the sake of convenience, let's just make them interchangeable. 60% of white South Africans speak the language Afrikaans, and they've been there since 1652. In the 1820s, a large group of British people came to South Africa, and subsequent to that, there has been an influx of some Portuguese fleeing the terrible, terrible events that happened in Mozambique and Angola in the 1970s. Christian Lebanese, people like myself, a few Irish, where I come from, there are quite a few, but not that many Irish throughout South Africa. So there's a bit of a sort of mongrelization of the other 40%. The first 60% that we discussed is far more homogeneous. One culture, one language, derived from 3 genetic strains, and interestingly, it's a very powerful genetic pool. 2 Indian scientists proclaimed last year that it is the genetic pool in the whole world of all cultures, races, whatever you like, that breeds the most true to type. So a very authentic group of people, as it were.
That's extremely interesting and extremely important, obviously. Now, I'm looking at your website here, Uitlanders.org, The Coming Revolution. I'm looking at the demographics. You have a beautiful graphic there of the total legal South Africa population, about 56 million, and about 81% of them are, I guess, black Africans or just Africans, and about 8% are white, and then you have here people on social grants, 30%, and taxpayers, about 4%. There's a lot of talk here in the United States and a lot of people thinking, I'm sure, about a race war. Here in the United States, we have about, I guess, 12, 13% of the population are black, which is very small compared to where you're at. Do the numbers represent a general threat that there's so many more blacks, or have you in your life interacted with blacks in a civilized way?
Yes, Dave, most certainly. I've been very fortunate to have had a number of experiences that have brought me very close to the black people in South Africa. When I was a young man, I was naughty, and my father gave me an ultimatum. He didn't kick me out of home, but he gave me an ultimatum, and I decided to accept it, as it were, and I left home, and I lived in a black migrant labor hostel, a single men's hostel, which is more or less something like, if you imagine, something like a Motel 6, almost a barracks. And imagine in the average hotel room that you would have something like 20 men sleeping together. There would be a series of single beds crammed next to one another, and two men would sleep like spoons on each of those single beds, and then in the crevices in between the beds, another man would sleep on the floor. Those migrant labor hostels are very common in South Africa. They go back to the era of apartheid, and many black people come from remote regions of South Africa. They don't have places to stay in the cities where they want to find work, and they stay in those hostels. And they naturally become overcrowded because there's too great an influx from these rural regions. And I lived in one of those hostels. I was one of 36 people sharing a room, and I learned to speak the Zulu language. And subsequent to that, I had the great privilege of working for a number of black clients for many years. In fact, before coming to the USA, I had the privilege of really enjoying great favor, charity and kindness and generosity from a black business that employed me. So I'm very, very fortunate to have really been able to experience these cultures and experience the good part of them, the good people of them. That's one thing that I will always be grateful for, particularly in such an unfashionable position as mine, where I represent an all-white organization preparing for a civil war. Although I have been told that I've become very unpopular back home in South Africa amongst the black people who I know well, in my own heart I can look myself in the mirror, as it were, and say, right, you are doing what you believe in and what you know to be good and preparing to protect your own people. But you are able to do so knowing that you are familiar with the people who now might hate you. I haven't just decided all by myself, never having experienced these cultures, that they're all bad and I'm just perfectly fantastic, and now I'm going to sort of oppose them or whatever. I think I'm privileged.
So people who might think that the black race on the whole is an inferior race, the blacks are stupid, they're not like whites, that's absolutely not the case.
It's certainly not universal. We have a situation in South Africa where the overwhelming majority of the population is, as you correctly described, black, approximately 80%, and there is a sort of a demagoguery amongst the leadership of the blacks. It's very populist, and many poorly educated people who believe the nonsense that has been fed to them by the liberal narrative over years, are inclined to support this anti-white thing, this thing of you stole all our land and you're rich and we're poor and now it's our turn to get everything for ourselves. But that is not every person all of the time. Many black people, people with whom I disagree stridently, people whose politics, if you ask me, are absolutely irrational nonsense, Marxist poppycock, are nevertheless people who show human kindness and generosity and goodness. So it's a nuanced thing, Dave. It's not just a black and white thing, a cut and dried thing where you just say all whites are good and all blacks are bad. That's absolute nonsense. In fact, I should point out that Suidlanders is a conservative Christian organization in Ethos. As I say, we're constituted under international law, which makes specific provision for civil defense organizations, not only but particularly in the protocols additional to the Geneva Convention, civil defense organizations of identifiable ethnic groups. So we are not Christian in that sense. We're not legally Christian, but our leadership is very Christian. We are overtly Christian conservative whites, and we have very, very strong feelings about that portion of the white population that is anti-Christian, materialist, globalist, liberal, A black person who refuses to abort their child is, in our eyes, not necessarily, that doesn't make them perfect, but that is a virtuous thing. And when a white person does cut the life out of their womb, we see that as a wicked thing. So it's a very nuanced thing, and unfortunately these conversations, such as the one you and I are holding now, are often held along far more simplistic lines than this conversation. Far too simplistic. In the end, they don't even make sense anymore. You get these raving lunatics on the right wing who cannot grant any credit to any black person for anything and almost refuse to see flaws in white people. And that's just not how Suidlanders looks at the world.
Thank you for explaining that, Simon. So you and your organization, you believe without a doubt that there is a conflict coming.
Yes, without a doubt. Dave, you know, it can be very difficult to convince people of this sort of thing, but I'll try to reduce it to the most simple argument, and hopefully people will see the value in that reasoning. Our founder, Gustav Müller, was in the South African Defence Force in military intelligence. So he has a background in risk analysis and scenario planning. He was in the Defence Force at a time when we were fighting 9 countries on the borders of South Africa, at a time when there was massive instability internally. The African National Congress's armed wing was terrorizing people. We all know the stories of Winnie Mandela and her football team, as it was called, who necklaced many black people, always black people. We know the stories of the tens of thousands of black people who died during the struggle of the ANC to take over power in South Africa. And dealing with that requires a lot of foresight when you are just 4.5 million white people attempting to perpetuate the system of apartheid. We're talking now about the late 80s and the early 90s. And Gustav was in a situation where he was required every day of his life to think very hard, to analyze and assess very well how things were going to play out, what was happening next, what intelligence could be produced from the information on the ground. And that gave an insight into how things might transpire in South Africa. He believed that things would end very badly once the African National Congress took power, as they did on the 27th of April 1994. And then he sort of bided his time for a while, observing how things were playing out. And it became clearer and clearer to him over time that all of the kind of suspicions, as it were, that the African National Congress, as a communist entity, was leading South Africa down a path of destruction. He began to employ the skills that he had obtained in military intelligence to assess the situation. And over the past 10 years or so, Suidlanders has been head and shoulders, far away, the most accurate predictor of developments in South Africa. And that's for the simple reason, let's leave aside the liberals and the government and all these people who speak so much nonsense, but even other right-wing organizations have tended to be sort of apologists for the new South Africa. They have tended to say, well, it's not that we're racist, but we're very concerned. Well, we don't hate black people, but things are not going well in South Africa. And to some extent, they've towed the party line. Whereas Suidlanders has been completely clinical in its analysis of what's transpiring. And therefore, we've been, as I say, by far the most accurate forecaster of things. Now, at the moment, we have a situation where we have 16.3 million people on social grants, and we have a taxpayer base of 3.1 million. The official unemployment figures, which are universally regarded as understated, are 38.1%. In fact, an international organization has just released in the past couple of days, I saw an article on our own website, our Afrikaans language website, that alludes to an unemployment rate of something like, I'm just doing the mental arithmetic, 56.3%. We have recently been downgraded, that is to say, South Africa's sovereign bond rating has been downgraded by Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor to junk status. And so the list goes on. We have amongst the highest rates of murder and rape in the world, generally across the board, and the murder of white farmers by black people in South Africa is the highest rate of murder of any select group anywhere in the world by a country mile, very famously. The murder of whites generally by black people is also a phenomenally high figure. It's something like 1,370% greater than the murder rate of all Americans, regardless of what race they are and by which race they are murdered. And these indicators, coming as they do in tandem with the promises that we've received from black leaders, particularly over the past year, of a race-based civil war to wipe out all whites, is fairly persuasive. People like myself are not buying up guns and storing up ammunition. I do not possess a firearm. Quite literally, people may think that that's crazy, but I don't. We're not endeavoring to spark a war. We are not planning to kill black people. We are purely and simply saying this thing is clear now. It's clear that everything that Gustav Müller predicted has been so consistently accurate over such a long period of time that you would have to have rocks in your head, really, not to be a little bit concerned and a little bit cautious. I think that's the gist of it, Dave.
People over here in the United States, I'm sure, and other countries have seen the photographs of the murders of these white farmers, and it's absolutely shocking. Is it that extreme, that severe, or do you believe some of these photos are perhaps photoshopped or presented in some other untruthful way?
Yes, I think that there is some exaggeration sometimes. I, in fact, made the mistake of using a photograph ostensibly of a farm murder of a woman from a reputable website. And to this day, for all I know, that photograph may be valid. But somebody said to me that it was not, and I immediately withdrew it from the PowerPoint presentation that we've been giving all across the USA. Because sometimes those things do happen. You know, people stir trouble. Sometimes it's people on the right wing, people who want to agitate other people's emotions more so that they can exploit them, and sometimes it's provocation from the government and intelligence circles. But nevertheless, if you leave aside that, the simple statistical reality is that white farmers are being killed by black people in South Africa at a higher rate than anywhere else in the world in any other group. To give you an idea, the murders of whites, not necessarily only farmers, but of whites, between the 1st and the 14th of February this year inclusive, was greater than the number of murders committed in the Republic of Ireland, which has a population of a similar size to the white population in South Africa, over the past 30 years. So these are facts that we're dealing with. It is a fact that over 74,000 white people have been murdered by black people since the beginning of this new South African rainbow nation, multiracial democracy. And it's easy for people to verify these things. So yes, sometimes people will, for their own ends, exaggerate these things and tell lies. They get a kick out of it. But if you leave aside that nonsense, it's still a statistical fact that the murder of whites in South Africa at the moment is a phenomenon that is not seen anywhere else in the world.
That's shocking. And of course, we met at a conference, the Nationalist Times Conference, and it was a great pleasure to meet you, Simon, and be able to spend some time with you. And I asked a question during your presentation that if it is like this, why is it that you folks just don't leave? Can you tell the listeners why that is and what you told me?
Two things to say. The first is that the white population of South Africa is now around about 4.7 million people. The statisticians tell us that it should, by rights, be just over 5.5 million people. 5,550,000 and some small change is a figure that I read recently. The missing 800,000 people are people who have indeed left South Africa. So 800,000 out of 5.5 million, that's about 1 in 7 if I'm not mistaken. That is a massive exodus of white people from South Africa. Usually to New Zealand and Australia, some to Canada and a few to the United States of America. Those that remain find it very difficult to leave because the exchange rate of our money is now so poor that you can leave South Africa as a millionaire and arrive in the USA and barely be able to afford a house. The value of our money has declined terribly. So many people who want to leave can't leave. It's not easy to get into other countries. They want you to come with bucks in your pocket. And the other thing, of course, and this is what counts for people like myself, is that some people don't want to leave. Some of us believe very much in our country, in our people, in the beautiful, beautiful land that our forefathers built with blood, sweat, and tears. South Africa was once one of the gems of the world. In my own lifetime, it cost $2 to buy one of our currency. And that is indicative of the phenomenal economy and the phenomenal country that we had. It's also a very beautiful country. At our second stop here in the USA, in Daytona Beach, Florida, we met a travel writer who said that he'd been to a certain number, I think it was 140 of the world's 190 odd countries during his career, and that South Africa, in his words, was head, shoulders, thorax, and abdomen the most beautiful country in the world that he'd seen in his entire career. We love our country, and besides that sort of positive impulse, there's also what you might describe as a negative impulse, and that is an unwillingness to capitulate to barbarianism. On principle, many of us are saying, where does it end? Where do we have to go to live in peace? Do we have to go to the USA? And if things change in the USA, do we have to go to Canada and then Australia and New Zealand? So the short answer for you, Dave, is that we who are Safelanders, those of us who would be regarded as right-wing-ish conservative Christians, just don't want to leave South Africa, and we don't want to capitulate to this wickedness. We'd rather stand our ground and come what may.
I should ask this before. The makeup of your group. You mentioned before that during the first wave of migration, there were a certain group of whites, and then the second in the 1800s. Your group is made up of similar a breakdown, or is it different?
Dave, our organization is overwhelmingly composed of the Boer people, of which I'm not. I'm one of fewer English speakers. Our organization is probably 90% Afrikaans language speaking. That means the Boer people, the people whose forefathers arrived in South Africa on the 6th of April, 1652, and in the decades immediately following that. It has always been the case that the Boer people of South Africa have been more conservative and more nationalist-oriented than the English-speaking or polyglot 40% of the white South Africans. However, we've seen quite a change in that right now. We're seeing many English-speaking people of various backgrounds joining Safelanders because we have a plan that is regarded in civil defense circles as the finest in the world. I almost said one of the finest, but the general consensus is that there is no plan like ours. And people who believe that things would just go swimmingly after the 27th of April 1994, when the African National Congress under the leadership of Nelson Mandela took power, are being disabused of that delusion. They're beginning to see that the promises that were made were simply untrue. By contrast, the predictions that were made from the right wing have proven to be true over and over and over again. They're not very fashionable. We had a certain dialectic, as it were, rammed down our throats by the international news media, the globalist news media, the liberal elites, and the academic elites for about 40 years, which said that apartheid is bad, those who support apartheid, the white South Africans, are bad people, that the blacks are innocent victims who can do no wrong, that the African National Congress is without peer, that Nelson Mandela was a pure soul, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. And that was persuasive. Many white people, many conservative white people, I count some in my own family in that group, began to believe that everything that they thought, every common sense conclusion that they'd drawn by themselves in their lives was false, and that it was time to be harmonious and integrated. But that has been consistently proven incorrect. Since the African National Congress took power in 1994, there has been a steady decline in every single facet of our country. Now, you might say, well, sometimes things don't go well. You've got to take the rough with the smooth. You spoiled whites had everything good in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now it's time to share the suffering of others. But there are two arguments against that. The first is we don't want to. We want to live in a decent, respectable, law-abiding society. There is nothing which says that we should enjoy being in a society that crumbles year after year after year through the ineptitude, laziness, and indeed deliberate perversity of our leaders and of many of those people who support them. The second argument against that sort of laissez-faire acquiescence to historical change is that it's not only about decline, it's about murder and rape. It's about things which by any standards should not be acceptable. and they should not be accepted. And so an organization like Satelanders, with its very conservative Christian ethos, kind of shamelessly says to the world, we don't care if we're unfashionable. We don't care if we don't correspond, or if our thinking doesn't correspond with the zeitgeist in Europe and in the USA, quite frankly, if I may say that. We don't want to be liberals because we have seen what happens when you put the liberals in charge. And you guys, with all due respect, should know better yourselves because you have certain litmus tests. You're able to see what happens when the liberals run a city like Chicago or Detroit or Baltimore or Atlanta into the ground for 30, 40, 60, or as I saw a beautiful YouTube video the other day, 83 years. That is what is happening in South Africa, and it's not good enough. This is not about being intolerant of black people. It's not about being intolerant of difference. It's about saying a line has been crossed by a long way and a long time ago, and we no longer feel the need to be ashamed of our outlook on how societies should be, what a civilized society should be all about. We are proud to reject things as they are, and we're proud to say, hey, the trajectory of this ball flying through the air is quite clearly going to hit the front window of your mom's house. The ball is in the air. We can see the direction that it's moving in. We can see the pace that it's moving in. And there is no sign whatsoever of it slowing down, stopping, or reversing in midair. So we are proud to make sensible preparations for an event which we keep on being told over and over and over again. And I can cite chapter and verse the names of the people, very, very senior black leaders, have made these forecasts and the very words that they've said. So we're proud to stand for something good for our people, our culture, our beliefs, and our history.
Thank you very much, Simon. Let me ask you this question here, and we're just about done. I appreciate all the time you're spending here with me. Do you see any parallels between what you're going through there in your country and now you've been here in the United States for 6 months, what's going on here in the United States?
Yes. Dave, I'd like to begin by saying one thing which some people may not appreciate, and I think that others will appreciate the relevance of this as a sort of a frame of reference of a sort to the direct answer that I'm going to give to the direct question. One of the weaknesses of the white peoples of the world at the moment is fractiousness. We can't agree on anything. And so it is that you have situations in which 10%, 15%, 13%, 20%, 25% of a population in a city that belongs to a certain racial group, let's say black people in Chicago or Detroit, will stand behind their mayoral candidate every time. They will stand in absolute unison. Whereas the whites will split their vote between the right, between middle-of-the-road conservatism, liberal Democrats, social Democrats, and so the list goes on, right across the broad spectrum. With that in mind, I'll answer you directly. The parallels are immaculate. It has occurred to me many times over the past 6 months that what one American said to us right at the beginning of our tour was absolutely true. He had an insight which I didn't possess. He said, you were indisputably, that is to say you, South Africa, were indisputably a guinea pig for the rest of the Western white world. In other words, they did something to you that they always intended to do to the rest of us. And over time, I've come to see that that guy really knew what he was talking about. Because what happened in South Africa and what is happening in the USA are, for all intents and purposes, identical. Yes, there are different numbers involved, different demographics, somewhat different circumstances, different wealth, different this, different that. But fundamentally, the media, the liberal elites, and the academic elites are persuading Americans to adopt values which are completely anti-American. Leave aside whatever Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton might say about what is American. You know, this is American or this is anti-American, American, American, American. Leave that aside for a second and use your own family as a reference point. Use your grandfather as a reference point. Go back 60 years and present the core values of American society to your grandfather as a young man. And imagine for yourself what he will say. What they've done is that they've taken the USA and sort of twisted it by 5 degrees at a time, 5 degrees, 5 degrees, 5 degrees, 5 degrees, to adopt values which were never part of the American mythos in the German sense of the word, never part of the core identity of America at all. And they've persuaded you that this is how you've always thought. It's unbelievable. The best example that I can think of is the music that young Americans listen to. That music was played to young Americans over and over and over and over and over again until they decided for themselves that they enjoyed R&B and hip-hop. It didn't come spontaneously from within. There wasn't a sudden, spontaneous falling in love by the young white Americans with this music. It took the elites years of ramming it down their throats and telling them that they should be enjoying this music, and they should be enjoying interracial relationships, and they should be enjoying the broad possible spectrum of sexuality, and they should be accepting this, and they should be accepting the other, and they should be welcoming refugees from totally alien cultures before these people actually started doing so.
Yes, absolutely. The elites, of course. Have you zeroed in on perhaps a common characteristics that these elites share? Is it one group of people that occupy the position of elites?
Dave, that's a very interesting question, and I understand what you're getting at. It fundamentally comes down to the Jewish question. Where does the Satelander stand on the Jewish question? We do not discriminate around the Jews, and for two simple reasons. Firstly, the Satlanders identified a long time ago that there are many, many people like us, as described in some documents written about 100 years ago, our forerunners, as it were, a guy that we place a lot of trust in. These people look like you, but they don't have your interests at heart. Now, that includes not just Jews. There are many ordinary Caucasian people who fall into that category, who are wicked to the bone. The second reason why we don't jump on the Jewish narrative is because we believe that we should be introspective about this matter. It's one of the core beliefs of Satlanders, is that you don't blame other people for the things that you're not teaching your children. If you are bringing your children up in the same way, to the extent that you can, obviously they go to school where they get different influences and so on and so forth. But if you let your children watch terrible things on television, don't blame the Jew for that. If you want to have a television in your house, if you want to have your child listen to that bullshit, excuse my language, then that's about you. It's not about the Jew boy who you believe is twisting the situation to his advantage. Now, I know that in the USA particularly, there are many, many people who stridently disagree with this position. But this is our position. This happens to be what we believe. We are firmly convinced that we are wrong the moment we start saying, it's all about that one over there. When we ourselves are permitting our daughters to have abortions, we're permitting our children to watch the most awful stuff on television. When they come home from school, we don't bring them up in the same way that our great-grandparents brought our grandparents up. It's just the way that we see things, Dave.
You're planning on going back to your country shortly, but you got some news, kind of a warning. Is this something you can share with the listeners?
Yes, I'm happy to share it with the listeners. Some months ago, I was phoned by a man who is known to be an agent for the South African Intelligence Services. I won't go into all of the details, but I assure you that this general understanding of who and what this guy is not based on figments of the imagination. And this guy said to me, look, Simon, it's time that you come out of the darkness into the light. You need to abandon this support for the Satlanders and this participation in this conservative cause, and you need to come over to the other side. And he was a bit like a policeman soliciting a bribe in South Africa. They do it all the time. He wouldn't be more bold than that. He wanted me to take the bait first and to say, you're so right. I've realized that these Satlanders are bad people and, gee, they hate blacks. And if only somebody would make it worth my while, I'd be more than happy to betray them or something like that. Of course, I didn't say that, but that's clearly what he was angling for. He phoned me a couple of weeks later at night, drunk. And he said to me, Simon, I'm phoning you because I like you. I had known him for some time before it became apparent that he was an agent. I'd known him for a couple of years and had extensive dealings with him. Not person to person, but over the telephone and the internet and what have you, extensive dealings. And he said to me, look, I really like you. I've always liked you. I've liked you from the beginning. You're a great guy. I'm phoning to give you your very last warning. We are going to put a bullet in your brain. And I'm going to be the one who puts the gun to your head and pulls the trigger. I have since been phoned 3 times from South Africa by somebody who is connected to the sorts of people that permit him to know what he's talking about. I'm choosing my words very carefully, as you can probably tell. Initially, he said, don't come back to South Africa. He said, there's nothing left here for you. Trust me, you will never work in this country again. You have shot your bolt, you've chosen your path, and it's over for you. If you come back to South Africa, you will find that there is nothing here for you except your children. He said, I understand you're very close to your children, you love your children, but really it's not in your interest to come home, notwithstanding that you have children here. Now, this guy knows my relationship with my kids, so that was a big thing for him to say. He phoned me subsequently and reiterated the same warning, and I said to him at one point, look, will I ever get a job in South Africa? And he laughed at me. He said, not only will you never get a job in your industry, which is live event industry, special projects, as a project manager of big, special, one-off kind of events, he said, you will never get a job in any industry because they will make it their business to find out where you are and to get you fired from that position, which is very easy in South Africa. And it's a long story. It's got something to do with our affirmative action laws. It's very, very easy to apply pressure to any employer in South Africa. And in the final phone call, the third of 3 phone calls, he said to me, again, I'm phoning to warn you because I like you. In fact, he used the word love. He said, I love you. I know what's on your heart. I've known you for many years and this and that. The next thing, I am phoning purely to warn you, to tell you that you are not going to live for your cause, which would be a heroic thing, to live for your cause. You are going to die for your cause. Do not come back to South Africa. So obviously I'm somewhat perturbed by that. On Saturday the 2nd, I will fly out of Orlando International Airport, and on Sunday the 3rd, I will land in Johannesburg International Airport. And obviously I'm concerned. I am concerned, but I must do it, Dave, because somebody has to do it. It's a bit like yourself and Phil Tony. You guys are making personal, individual sacrifices that are not in the interests of your families because you believe, you know that what you're doing is right. You've seen all the evidence. You've weighed it up over years. You've given it thousands of hours of thought. You've agonized over it. You've lost friends in the process. You've lost your job in the process. And yet you know that if you don't do what you are doing with Phil Tony to expose the scandal of the USS Liberty, nobody else is going to do it. And it's a desperately required thing. So come what may, I'm going to go home and face the music because really it's not going to serve any purpose for me to run away.
I wish you the best of luck, my friend, and I hope that this fellow, whoever he is and whoever he represents, that his prediction does not come to pass, and that we can speak again in the future to help spread the word. And Simon, I want to thank you so much for the time you spent explaining all this to the listeners in the eloquent way in which you presented it, and I am so looking forward to speaking to you again real soon.
Gee, thank you very much, Dave, and thank you for having me on. Thank you for all the goodness that you and Phil showed me, and in a sense you represent many right-wingers in the USA who've reached out to us in the spirit of compassion and been very kind and generous and helpful over the past 6 months. So I say thanks to you as a representative of that group of people.